is appalling. That's not something that I'm telling you because I'm, whatever, I misunderstand Islam, but that is report after report. And the latest one is the United Nations UNDP Human Development Report that was first published in 2002, and that was again published in 2003, 2004. And if you follow these reports, this is empirics. This is not something that I'm imagining. The situation of women in the Middle East, in Muslim countries, is dire. And the principles that underlie it and the practices are Islamic. It's Sharia law in action. And the appalling, the nightmare is women who have fled those countries, who are now in the West, American citizens, European citizens, are subjected to parts of Sharia law. And Ziba, I think that denying that kind of, not just as a matter of debate, but I then try to question, where does your solidarity lie as a woman who grew up in a free country, a free woman, and as vocal as you are, shouldn't you be more solidar with them?
I am.
I
am. But I absolutely am, and as all women should be, and actually all human beings should, to demand the rights of equality. In fact, most Muslims want equal rights for the women in their societies. And if it goes to, just go to the research, go to the polls, go to the research on what it says. When you ask men, should women have equal rights? Majority in the countries surveyed, in the Gallup survey, said yes, they should have equal rights, including in Saudi Arabia.
I want to acknowledge that a lot more needs to be done and a lot more needs to be said about eliminating some of the practices that you referred to, Ayan. And I recognize that there are practices in Muslim-majority societies across the world that are repugnant, not just to a Western mind, but generally to any decent, rational human being. But I want to approach this being a man, and the first man on the panel to comment on this question. Great. I want to approach this from a slightly different angle, and that is this, that many of you in the audience are men. And if the law of average was to fall true, then you'd be probably around 50%. Now, how many of you would be comfortable with your spouse, your wife, as your boss at the same time? And it may sound, it may actually be a truism, because for many people in a marriage, the boss is the wife. But the reason I'm asking that question is that even in times like today, many men find that uncomfortable, to be married to their boss. And yet, Ayan, who referred to these practices that were repugnant to us, and said that they are sourced in Islam. The founder of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, his boss, his first wife, was his boss. And many people don't know that. And so what I want to demonstrate by this point is that it's a complex matter. There are practices in Muslim-majority societies that we need to reform, but it's too simplistic to trace them back to the life of a man who lived 1400 years ago, and in many of his practices was quite revolutionary for his time, and in others was like every other man during his time. So the fact that Douglas referred to the fact that he had a bride that was underage is something which we can now look back on and say that was an awful practice. But just as we look back on many things that Romans did and say that was an awful practice, just as we look back on many things that Martin Luther did and said that was an awful practice. But we don't judge these men by the standards that we have today.
Let's bring in Douglas Murray.
No, we do, and we should. We should, Majid. And may I say, it's a bit too cutesy to compare a man who raped a 9-year-old girl repeatedly with men being, the wife's a bit of the master of the household and so on. A bit too cutesy and a bit too much avoiding the issue, which is this, that this is actually a very real concern which doesn't just apply in mid-7th century Arabia, but today, here and now, in Britain. In my own country, we now have, thanks to an arbitration act put into a law in the 1990s, whereby people can have civil disputes arbitrated under laws that they can decide on, that we now have Sharia courts in Great Britain. And the Sharia courts that in Great Britain are operated by people who are actually clerics. They are religious authorities. There's one at the moment, Siddiqui in Leicestershire. Now this man runs a set of Sharia courts. A couple of years ago, it turned out that we found out a little bit about the sort of thing he was deciding. And sadly, again, it's not reformist stuff, because when you go back to the Sharia, people take the lessons from it and they make judgments like the following: 6 women who had gone to the Sharia courts because they were being physically physically abused by their husbands. They were persuaded to drop the cases because this should be a matter between a Muslim woman and her Muslim husband and the Sharia court. This should not be a matter for the police in Great Britain in 2008. That stinks. What's more, there was in another case, a local Muslim man died. His will was arbitrated by Sharia because that was what happens now in 21st century Britain. And the arbitration of this man's will gave half the inheritance to the daughters as to the sons of the man, because that's what you have in the Quran.
But
so it's all very well to say
Mudge just
that it's
actually
something
said that he agrees with you that this stuff needs to change.
But the point is that when you look at the courts that are doing this, when you look at the religious authorities, when you look at the clerics, the judgments they're making, those are the kinds of judgments. I wish that Majid would get some clerics on his side who could set up rival Sharia courts that didn't decide that women were second-class citizens. But sadly, at the moment, that is the case.
So, Douglas, actually, the irony was, that, as you know well, that the person who came out most publicly in support of those regrettable Sharia courts in the UK was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and we at Quilliam opposed their creation. And actually many Muslims in Britain do oppose their creation because it raises the question. Islam has never had a clergy, it's never had a pope, and so when you try and institute Sharia courts as law, the question arises, whose Sharia do you follow? Now that's an internal debate that's going on and raging, and that I'm part of in Pakistan, for example, because there isn't one version of Sharia, and everything you've referred to is bad. We condemn these practices, but the fact is we can't call them, we can't be reductionist, essentialist, simplistic, lack nuance and call it Sharia, because there isn't one Sharia, as you well know, just as there isn't one reading of Shakespeare.
All right, I want to move on, and when we come back, we're going to take questions from the audience. All right, so we're going to go to questions from the audience now, and if you raise your hand, what I'll do is take a cluster of questions and then start presenting them to the panel. And I just want to remind you, if you'll get a microphone, please stand up and hold it about 2 fists away from your mouth so that the radio can pick you up. And please keep it as terse as possible right against the wall there. And blue shirt here. And eyeglasses and green. All right. So you get 30 seconds to ask your question. It makes me nervous that you've got something written down on a piece of paper.
Under 30 seconds, I promise.
All right, go ahead.
Zeba, in your opening remarks, you said that Islamic terrorists are motivated by politics, not religion. Considering that Islamic terrorists make up the majority of suicide terrorists in the world today, what's happening to Muslims politically that isn't happening to any other major religious group that can account for the disproportionate amount of terrorism coming out of the Islamic world?
Bingo. That was a good question.
Yeah, that's
That is
under 30 seconds.
Yeah, that was a great question.
Your number. I'm going to take the questions.
Oh,
and
sorry.
then number 2. Yeah. Yes, I'm ready for you, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. There, with the microphone. Yes, you, sir.
The question was relatively similar, but I'll make it. This has to do with the Muslim community's reaction to suicide bombings. You stated there's 1.5 billion Muslims, and yet the silence of this community on suicide bombings, the justification, the rationalization, the wiggles from the community, from the religious community, from the Muslim states, Arab states and Muslim states, is something that in the West we find puzzling. How would the panelists react to that?
Thank you. And third question?
I hope this isn't too naive, but if Islam is not a religion of peace, is it possible for it to become one?
Wow, I think that's a great question, actually. I was trying to get at that with the reform issue, but I just think you put it far more eloquently. So I'm going to take all those questions because I thought they were all good. Zeba, do you want to take the response to the first one? Basically, why the preponderance of terrorism, the questioner is saying, is committed by Muslim extremists. Why are we not seeing that happening from other groups?
So what I can't say is, I know that it's a complicated question, and so you have history involved, you have different factors that contribute to the answer. What I can say for sure, just based on looking at the studies that come out, is that the level of religiosity, the level of piety of violence, of terrorists, compared to mainstream Muslims, is virtually, there's no difference. So it's literally, when you ask them how practicing they are, how often do they attend services, things like that, it's literally the same. So that can't be the distinguishing factor. What we do know, as I mentioned earlier, is when you ask them, the one big difference is when you ask them what they fear the most. And they say their perceived idea of Western domination, which is very similar to what we hear from our opposition, a perceived fear of Islamic domination.